morning, Church One. It is good to be with you again. I was driving one of my high school kids to a Bible study, and they turned to me and they just said, "Here's the thing, Dad. It's a little boring. It's boring because I kind of already know all the stories." And I remember thinking at the time, yeah, like, you know all the stories, but you don't know how the stories impact your story. And that really is not just a high school kid problem. That's a problem that a lot of us face when it comes to the Bible and God and our relationship with God. It's how does our story, the story we're telling ourselves about our lives, intersect with God's story? In today's passage in Genesis, we have like a really good example of the kind of how those things can happen. We're continuing to look at Genesis, the first family of faith, this wonderful dysfunctional family of Abraham. And today we're going to look at Abraham's grandsons, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, who are the sons of Isaac, Abraham's son. And I want us to read it with this lens of how, like, life stories interact with God's story. And I want us to be in some ways kind of like an exercise in us learning to pay attention to both. So I'm going to ask you some questions in the midst of it, but I want you to kind of use this as a time to pay attention to not only, God's story in the Bible, but like your story and how they might interact. And why don't I pray for us, and then I'll read the passage and we'll jump in. Lord, I do pray that you would give us the grace to pay attention to our stories, to your stories. Open up our hearts, fill our minds, bless us for this time. In your name we pray, amen. So Genesis 25, 19 to 34 says this: "These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is to be this way, why do I live?' So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the elder shall serve the younger.' When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first one came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob," which means heel snatcher, by the way. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I'm famished." Therefore he was called Edom, which means red. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Then thus Esau despised his birthright. But again, this is what I want us to learn, is to, like, how do we see how our stories interact with God's stories? And so the first thing is really to pay attention to our stories. I mean, this is a life story, right? This is the life of Jacob and Esau. What do I mean by stories? What I don't mean by that is every exhaustive detail of someone's lives. Stories are really, what I mean by stories are how we shape our identity. They're the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and our place in the world. And our sense of identity is a really powerful thing. Psychologist and author Dan McAdams argues that if you really want to know someone, you must know their story. Think about this. Like, if you walk in and you observe someone from afar, you can, and maybe even have a brief conversation with them, you can kind of assess sort of like who they are. You can make cultural assumptions about them. You can kind of even maybe if you're good at this stuff, pick up on temperament issues as you observe them. But if you really want to know them, if you really want to know a person, McAdams argues, and I agree, you have to know their story. What's kind of their inner narrative? How do they see themselves and the world around us? And one of the things I want to think about this morning, and I think this passage gives us good insight into, is how do stories get built? Because Jacob and Esau were living stories, right? They were living out of inner narratives they had of themselves. And stories, I'm going to argue, get built. There's lots of things that build into stories, but I want to pull out like 3 elements that I think are implicit in this passage. And they're foundational parts, formational parts, and functional parts. The first are foundational parts. In all of our lives stories, there are foundational things that were placed in there kind of from the beginning, things that sort of got laid down below the surface of our lives that are just kind of in there. They're baked into us, as it were, where we live, some of our physical nature, a family of origin, the time and place that we live, right? Like, take a look at like some of the foundational elements in Esau and Jacob's lives, right? It starts in the womb, there's just this like built-in sibling rivalry. They're wrestling each other, like even in the womb. Their birth order, it played a significant role in their life story. The fact that Esau was first and Jacob was second. The fact, their physicality, like it says Esau was a hairy man, right? He's the name Esau, and then Edom. That's where the Edomite tribes come from, and you'll read about later in the scriptures. But Esau's like physical nature, the fact that he would grow up to be a skillful hunter, and Isaac, Jacob being born second and grasping at the heel and being more of a quiet person. These are all foundational elements, right, of who we are. They're sort of baked in. You don't really exercise any control of them. They just sort of come their way, and they begin to shape your story. I mean, foundational things often shape our stories. I wonder how much, like, you think about the foundational things of who you are. How much do you let them kind of influence your story? How much control do you think they have over your stories? What is it like to just, be curious about kind of where you came from, the time you were born, the family in which you were born into, some of the dynamics of that. What does it look like to be curious about, like, your physical presence in the world? Are you masculine, feminine, your physical traits, your abilities, some of your talents, some of your gifts? What about some unique opportunities? There was sort of a divine plan built into this with Esau and Jacob. What are some unique breaks or opportunities? What are, to be aware, like, there's foundational things in your story, and sometimes it's easy to ignore them or be ashamed of them or whatever. Wish you had different ones. But how much thought do you give to these foundational elements of your story and the role that they're playing? Another thing about a component of our story are what I would call the formational parts of our story. Formational parts are things that happen to your life, in your life. They sort of come at you and they shape you, and they play a role in your life. Maybe they're not as baked in as the foundational elements because you can kind of interact a little bit with the formational elements, but they're there and they shape your story. Look at some of the formational elements of Jacob and Esau's life, right? The parents are a huge element of this, formational element. Isaac liked Esau better. Rebecca liked Jacob. Can you imagine how that shaped them? Again, Esau being the skillful hunter and a man of the plain, and Jacob being a man in the tents. Like, how did people's interactions with people on that level, how did that shape them? People respond and treat you differently. Formation. I think we're becoming aware of, like, all sorts of ways that we treat people differently based on like who they are and how much that shapes their own sense of self-awareness and the stories and the narratives they tell about themselves. Life gives us inputs, and those inputs shape what we think about ourselves. Let me tell you a little story. When I was around 10, maybe a little younger, about half a mile from my house, there was an abandoned big wooden spool thing that they used, I guess at some construction project or something, to run big heavy wire somewhere. It was a spool pretty big on the ground, and the wires were gone, and it kind of sat there unused for months and months. And so one day my dad decided that we would bring it home because it would serve as a really good kind of coffee type table for our screened-in porch. So he got my older brother Brian and me to go with him to get it and bring it home. And for some reason, we needed some wire cutters. I can't remember why we needed wire cutters to do this. It was small ones, nothing big. But they sent me home to get them. And I remember running home with this thought in my head. I don't really know what wire cutters are. I kind of thought I knew, but I didn't really know. And I ran all the way down into my dad's tool shed. I grabbed what I thought must be wire cutters, turned around, ran the half mile or so back to where they were waiting for me. And there I handed them a pair of pliers. And I can just remember my dad and my brother just being like, what are you, these aren't wire cutters. And they're, oh man, they've been sitting there waiting to kind of get to the next step. And I had to go back. And, it was just one of these moments, right? They were frustrated. Look, that story in its sense is no big deal, right? But here's the deal. I remember it. And I remember because I think it was a foundational and formational thing that sort of played into my sense of myself. And here's how it played out. To this day, whenever I'm doing a job with tools, I am really, I don't have a lot of confidence. I don't feel, I expect it to go wrong. I expect to screw it up. It's part of the narrative I tell myself whenever I'm doing a job. So doing jobs for me are tense and frustrating, and I just expect to fail. And that's hard, it may seem like no big deal to you. I remember talking to a guy, and he talked about, doing jobs around the house, and his mindset is, I figure if some other idiot can do it, I ought to be able to figure it out. That's how he thinks about it. I don't think about things like that way. And this is part of my narrative. Maybe for you it's something different. Maybe you'd struggle reading, and being asked to read as a kid in school was this incredibly painful experience to read out loud. Maybe that shapes your story. But here's the deal, right? Foundational, formational things really shape our story. And they end up, and this is the last part, they end up coming out in functional ways, right? So part of this narrative for me around, jobs around the house is it's difficult. It shows up functionally when I'm asked to do things. I feel like an idiot. I expect to fail. I always figure I'm going to miss something. And, that can be stressful and frustrating and challenging, and functionally it shows up that way. It's interesting to look at Esau and Jacob in this story, right? And it shows when they get to this whole interchange about the birthright. Now, what was the birthright? The birthright was, it's something that might not make sense to us, but in a primogeniture culture, that's very agricultural, hunting-oriented culture, the oldest got a double portion of the inheritance. So if there was 100 acres of land, and each one was supposed to get 25 acres, the oldest would get 50, and the others would have to divide up the rest, right? It was a blessing. It was the way, and it set in the social structure of the day. It set it. And here's Esau, the oldest. He's physically, he has a big physical presence. His dad loves him. He's dad's guy. all of this stuff functionally shows up in his life. He's very present tense. He doesn't care about the future. He just shows up. He kind of lives at the level of this physical. He's like, I'm famished. I don't care. What do I care about my birthright? I'm going to die. Like, give me some of that stew. That's just what I want. Like, I love how he I love how it ends. Like, Esau ate, he drank, he got up, and he went away. All those are like really action verbs. And that just describes probably Esau, his functioning in the world. And all of this is based in ways in his story. Now look at Jacob, right? Jacob, he's the heel grabber. He's the second born. He's always grasping at his big brother, and he's always kind of feeling like he's in a fight with someone. He's got to figure it out, and he's got to think his way through things. He can't physical his way through them. So he has this whole scheme and plan with Esau and the stew. And I can manipulate Esau mentally, and all of this. Like he was probably, some of this is foundational, some of this is formational. He was mom's guy, not dad's guy. And imagine how this like functionally shapes his story, right? I often think like, I talk about like things happening here that can't happen anywhere else. And I always dream of us as being a community that learns to share our sins and our struggles and our stories, to take those things and to turn them to Jesus. That we become people here, that we learn how to take our struggles and our sins and our stories and turn them to Jesus. And I believe our stories are sacred things. And learning to like think about functionally how, like in community, we bump into each other all the time, and we get on each other's nerves, and we try to figure things out, and we try to make things happen functionally. And do we have the capacity to like get in touch with our own stories? What's driving a lot of this behavior? So you have to really learn to pay attention to your story, the foundational, the formational, and the functional elements. I believe that's exactly what we see here in Isaac and Jacob, and I think it's a good opportunity to think about ourselves. But the second major point is like, how do we pay attention to God's story, right? If I just ended it here, this would be a good psychological exercise, which there's something wrong with that. But if I just ended it here, that's all it would be. But as Christians, we believe there's another actor in the story, and it's God. But it's not always easy to see God's role. And so learning to pay attention to God is harder than you would think. Like even in this passage, like, what is God doing? A whole lot of formational and functional things were happening kind of with no real respect or thoughts about God seemingly at all. But yet all along, all implicit in this, God is acting. God is actually doing things, but you have to learn to pay attention. So what's God up to here? Well, go back to the one time in this whole passage where God speaks, right? It's only Jacob and Esau would never even hear it. Only Rebecca, the mom, heard it. But God speaks about like, there's two nations in your womb, like two people that are founding nations, but the older is going to serve the younger. There's a complete reversal of this sort of primogeniture culture going on, that God is sort of sovereignly overseeing. And not only is he sovereignly overseeing, but what is he doing? God is showing mercy. God is showing sovereign grace. Like in Romans 9, Paul talks about this passage, and he says God is like acting out of his own choice to mercifully, gracefully choose Jacob. That's what he's doing. Just out of mercy, out of grace. Remember what I said, like that, like this was a primogeniture culture. Like the people that kind of got to run the cultural narrative were the firstborns. It was a hunter-gatherer, agricultural culture. The people that got to kind of run the narratives were the men and the fighters and the hunters and all that kind of stuff. And God doesn't pick like the person who gets to really tell the cultural story and say, that's my person. Now, I know some of you are thinking, what about Esau? Does God love Esau? Does God have a plan for Esau? I think he does. Go, if you want to, I'm not going to develop now. Hebrews 11:20 is an interesting verse to kind of think about and ponder. And, does God just hate Esau? I don't know that he does, not in a way that we typically interpret Romans 9, but I'm going to get us way far afield. I'm not going to go there. I want you to just see this kind of like, that even Jacob's whole story, that the older will serve the younger, is a story of grace. It's God's grace breaking into kind of this cultural narrative, this story that existed that was shaping and forming people. And God is saying, no, I'm going to tell a different story, and it's a story about my mercy and grace. And the rest of Jacob's drama, which you'll see in the rest of Genesis, is Jacob has to believe that God mercifully cares for him. And he's got to learn to trust that, because that's not the story that Jacob tells himself. Now, some of you might think, well, like primogeniture, like that's a weird thing. The oldest getting all this kind of stuff. I know I'm a second born. I've never understood the oldest getting the double portions. What is all that about? Like, that just seems like a strange cultural thing. But, we have our strange cultural things. Ann and I had a long drive this summer, and so we listened to a book on tape by Barbara Kingsolver called Demon Copperhead. It's long and it gets a little slow at times, but it's really a powerful fictional story. It's based off of Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, which was written in the 1800s, that really exposed the plight of orphans in that day. And so Barbara Kingsolver tries to kind of transport that story into our modern day by telling a story from a perspective of an orphaned boy in modern day Appalachia. And we listened to it on Audible, by the way, and the narrator is amazing. His voice just fits the story so well. But this is basically a story about an overlooked, neglected, and abandoned boy fighting, kind of like Jacob would have been, fighting for love and his place in the world. There's one foster home that the boy's placed with, and he's placed with a number of other boys, and the boys are basically used as slave labor and neglected and not really cared for at all, except for one of the foster boys who's a little bit older than the other boys, and he happens to be this good-looking football star at the local high school. This boy, even though he was an orphan too, has the whole world open to him. He even has his own pickup truck as an orphan. And even the adults in the community are deferential to this one foster child because he's the good-looking football star. I love the name that Kingsolver gives him in the story. His name is Fast Forward, right? In a world where all the orphans are stuck in place and going nowhere, Fast Forward is moving somewhere because he's the good-looking football star, right? You have to read the book, but, Esau's basically fast forward, right? That he gets the double portion of the blessing, and Demon Copperhead is basically Jacob, having to fight his way to find the love that he needs. And most people today don't think Demon Copperhead doesn't have a story to tell. They want to hear a fast forward story. They'll watch it on Netflix, but they don't think Demon Copperhead has a story to tell. And so Demon Copperhead has to fight for his place in the world. And I think, a lot of people can relate to Demon Copperhead. And the real hidden, thread of Esau and Jacob's story is that, God picks Demon Copperhead. God picks Jacob. And he does it because he's merciful. He's compassionate. He's gracious. Jacob didn't deserve to be picked. God just picked him because he's gracious and he's loving. Where is God in Jacob's story? He's in this place of mercy and grace. He's this actor in this drama that's not acting at all according to everyone else's strict script. Instead, he's acting in this place of mercy and grace. I know one quote I love by Dallas Willard. He says, "I know right where God lives. He lives at the end of your rope." In the stories that we tell ourselves, if we want to find where God is, my challenge is to find him in these places of mercy and grace. Where are you needy? Where are you broken? Where is your story not working anymore? Well, that is often the place where you find God. Our new offices are over on Bosley Hall. We had the open house a few weeks back. Was great. And that, as many of you know, that's the old Towson jail. And this past Thursday, July 13th, there was a memorial at the jail. You see, and you can read, there's a plaque right out in front of our office building. But part of the history of that old jail building is that in the 1880s, a 15-year-old African-American boy was accused of raping a white woman and put in that jail. And the night of July 13th, a group of 70 or so white people broke into the jail and lynched him before his trial on a sycamore tree behind the building. The sycamore tree isn't there anymore. He was denied his rights for a trial, and he lost his life there. It happened on July 13th, so I guess every year for the past few years, on the evening of July 13th, a group of people holds a vigil in remembrance of this boy. I don't know much about it. I just got an email about it because we're in the offices now, and I thought, I should probably go to this thing. So I did, And they had some poems, and they had some speakers, and I was listening, and I'm thinking, like, wow, this is a part of our story in Towson. This is a part of the Towson story. And the comment was made, and I hadn't even thought about it, but this lynching was not only tragic for the loss of the life of the boy, but this lynching was sending a message to the African-American community that lived in East Towson, right over here, about their safety, about their security, about their place in this society. And that became part of their story, right? And we're still sort of living elements of that story, foundational, formational, functional. At one point in the vigil, they invited an older woman from an AME church that exists just off Delaney Valley Road. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. And this church they got to talk was built by slaves, still in existence. And this church surely would have felt the weight of this event in the 1880s. Imagine if something like this happened to one of our 15-year-olds. Like, would that not be like a shaping event for us? Well, she sang this old spiritual. She got up to speak, and she sang this old spiritual about walking with Jesus. Wish I could remember the song. I can't. But I just sat there, and I'm trying not to be dismissive or over sanctimonious or any of that. But I'm sitting on the curb outside of our offices here at Bosley Hall, hearing this sad story of injustice, and yet finding myself sensing, like in the midst of this really sad story, that God is here. As this woman was singing the spiritual, that in the midst of this, that Jesus is here. Now, I know that is complex, complicated, and again, I'm not trying to be dismissive or simple-minded about that. I just think this is an example of our stories, God's stories, connecting. You see, your story merges with God's story at this deep place of mercy and grace and need. Jesus did not come to the world as some self-help coach. He came as a Savior who died on the cross for you. Stanley Hauerwas, a theologian, said that if the church forgets God's story, if the church forgets the gospel story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, it becomes too damn boring. Like my son said, we kind of already know the stories. But what happens when those stories become part of your story? When those stories become a vessel for God's mercy and grace to touch your life, for God's story to invade and break into the story you're telling yourself, a story that probably isn't going to get you to a good place, that is not boring. That is life-changing and life-giving. Where does God's mercy and grace intersect with your life? I want you to think this week about your story. What are some of the foundational, formational, and functional elements of your story? What kind of story are you trying to live? How's it working for you? Where in that story do you need the mercy and grace of God? Do you know God's story? Do you know the story of mercy and grace? Can you let it in? Can you allow it to shape your story and the events you're living and making sense of even this week? What does that mean for you? Let me pray. Lord, I ask that you would help us to be aware of our stories, but also help us to be aware of your story. Help us turn to you, Lord. Help us see you as that merciful, holy, just, righteous, gracious, loving God that can be a powerful element in our stories. Lord, may we turn to you this week with our stories. May we receive your mercy and grace. In your name, amen. Thank you, Church One. Have a great week.